Hello and welcome. We are really pleased to be able to introduce Paul Caponigro. He's more than just a talented photographer, he is a gifted visual artist. He shares his vision and creativity through his images, and you'll be seeing that today. He does lectures, seminars, and workshops as well as writing, and today he'll share his creative process and inspire you in this journey of discovery. And one of my favorite quotes of JP's is, "How the artist gets there is, perhaps, just as important as how they arrive." JP is a member of the Photoshop Hall of Fame. He's a Canon Explorer of Light, and he's a contributing editor to photographic magazines and a sought-after lecturer around the world. So we're pleased to be able to present our series of photographers at Google, Mr. Paul Caponigro. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you, Google. Thank you guys for coming today. Thanks for helping build something I use every day. It's a different world as a result of what you guys are doing, and it's pretty cool. I wanted to talk today briefly, maybe a little too briefly, we just scratched the surface about the creative process. There's a lot of pixel peeping that goes on in the industry of digital photography, and in many ways, those subjects can be the easier things to discuss. Sometimes maybe we don't talk about the creative process, how we got, where we started, why we ended up where we ended up. Those are sometimes a lot harder to discuss. And in part, I think that's because it's a process of discovery. Particularly as artists, we don't always know what our end result is until we get started. But somewhere along the way, we start to get clues, like solving a mystery. We find pieces that start to fit together, and we do get into certain creative modes and perform certain creative operations that are repeatable, can be consistent, that we can share with other people, and those are the kinds of things I want to discuss somewhat today. One definition of creativity, and I know that there are a lot of them. You can find a whole collection of quotes on creativity on my website. I collect quotes and I put them out on my social networks, including Google+. One definition of creativity is to create a shift in perspective, to see things in a new light. And one of the things that I wanted to do is share some of the stories behind a few of my images, both as a visual introduction to the kinds of things that I do, and as a way of sharing how being engaged in a creative process, and I really like to talk about it as a creative process, not necessarily engaged in photography, not necessarily engaged in drawing, not necessarily engaged in writing, or any of the other creative operations, modes, media that I use synthetically, holistically in my process. When you engage in that, your perception shifts. We do this in part to understand the world a little better and also to understand what's inside of us, which is often one of the hardest things to bring to light and one of the reasons that I make the types of images that I make. Robert Frost said something that I think is wonderful. No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. So I think that process of discovery has to start here with each of us in a creative process. So we have to be creative with our process, and that each one of our processes will change over time, and then each one of ours is unique. There's a different state or a different flow at different times. So I want to share some of the stories that have changed the way that I think about making images and think about photography, or just images in general. One of the reasons I got involved with photography is that photography can show us so much. And I think one of the best things about photography is that it can record so much detail. And one of the worst things about photography is that it can record so much detail. And the big question then is what's inside the frame significant detail? Secondarily, how do we know? One of the things that attracts me most to photography is that it can freeze a fast-moving moment like this. I can sense these complex relationships dimly, perhaps diffusely, but they're moving too fast for me to really consider them at length and to compare them to patterns before and after and how they change. There's something about the still image being able to freeze really complex relationships that's really quite fascinating. You could look at Edward Muybridge's work and how it changed the way that we think about time and motion, how it answered the debate of whether a horse's hoofs are all off the ground as it runs. One interesting question becomes, at what point do we stop verifying our own direct perception and rely on the documents, the objects that we create, as a way of deciding what's real or truthful. We're in this very interesting time where we're becoming increasingly cybernetic, and we're deferring that notion of the eyewitness to the tools that we use. And we have to be careful about that because we're deeply involved in the creation of the tools, the objectives, how they're used. Objectivity only happens by degrees. What you know changes what you see. What you see changes what you know. The French psychologist Piaget really tells us about this whole process. And I think it's one of the reasons why a visual creative discipline is so important, because the more you can see, the more you know. And the more you can see in many ways, well, you can see even more. I find it fascinating that a viewer's knowledge base changes the questions that they ask, and I think it's so important to ask questions. Photographers will often come up to me, look at this image, and ask, how did you get that exposure? There's very little light. I know that long exposure, the light on the water should have blurred to this mist. How'd you get that? So, well, I took a clue from Steven Spielberg, and I exposed by day and color adjusted to make it look like night. Oh, you cheated. And it's a funny statement because we really have to ask, whose game are we playing? I mean, there are rules of the game, but there are many different rules. One of the challenges in photography is we have only one word for photography. Now, are we talking about Jerry Ullsman's surrealism, or are we talking about James Nachtwey's frontline documentary? We expect very different practices as a result, but we have one word for them both. And that, to me, seems woefully lacking. We need to update our whole concept so that we can communicate more clearly. Look at what writers do. Can you imagine having one word for writing? Screenplay, fiction, poetry? Or how about just fiction and nonfiction? It's a lot more elegant than photograph and photo illustration. What kind of photo illustration? For medical and forensics? Or for, you see where I'm going, right? We need to update our language. Astronomers ask me entirely different questions. They say, where did you find that constellation? I don't recognize it. I said, yes, you're right. I painted it in Photoshop to make it look more like my eye sees and less like the hard colored points that sometimes streak in the camera. Right? So based on their knowledge base, they're looking at it totally differently and making different assumptions and bringing something different to the game. And I think we have to understand that our viewers are always bringing something to the game of looking. And it is a game. There are rules, there's a context, but also it's fun. It's really interesting. It's like solving a mystery. We all see different things. One of the reasons this is my favorite image probably is not only because it started a whole new relationship with one of my formal obsessions, symmetry. It's been a great device to suggest that other things have a life and a spirit, but also because it highlights this process of the viewer's involvement and it enriches my understanding of my own work. One evening in a gallery, a gentleman reeking of scotch and smoke came up to me and said, I love your satanic icon. And I'm looking around the room, and he leads me to this. And I kept asking him what he was up to, but I didn't share my original thoughts or what I was thinking at the time because it changes over time. It gets more complex, it grows. Because I thought he was sufficiently inebriated that, well, I have this deal that if I share what I share, I first get the other person to share what they felt, and I don't want my interpretation to supplant theirs. I just want the exchange, to enrich the whole thing. A good friend of mine bought this image, brought it home to his wife. Look, isn't it beautiful? Where should we hang it? You're not hanging that in here. Why not? It's dirty. What do you mean it's dirty? It's an X-ray of somebody sitting on the toilet. Can't you see? Just keep going. Just keep going. One of the other things is I got one of the best compliments of my career from a 4-year-old who crossed the threshold and stopped, held his breath. I said, okay, I don't care how often it sells. I don't care where it gets collected. If you can catch the breath of a 4-year-old, success. And then the arms go flying. He starts sputtering. It was the first time I really was happy there was glass in front of my prints. Right. And he says, it's a giant sneeze. And I'm sitting over in the corner of the gallery watching this whole process thinking, I titled it Avra, which is the Sanskrit word for breath. Breath, sneeze, close enough. It's interesting to ask just how specifically we want to communicate our intention and how often it gets looser and yet there still is a common connection, a common thread. And I think we want to look for that. Sometimes the stories that other people have shared about my images change my reaction to them, and I'm sure that it happens between each other. I'll just share one of the mysteries here. This image is profoundly challenging to me because the first time I exhibited, 4 women over the space of a weekend came and shared stories in front of it about losing a significant male figure, a son, a father, a lover. The strange thing is it's happened more than 2 dozen times over the past 15 years. I can't explain it. I can sweep it into that dustbin called coincidence, but I think it has something more to do with Jung's idea of synchronicity. There's something happening in front of that, and I don't know what that is. In fact, I'm trying to figure it out and explore it a little more deeply and wondering how can I get into that territory where something more universal is shared, and how can I do work that's a little bit beyond me, because that's where the areas of greatest growth are. I think sometimes not knowing is actually a benefit. I remember being in another gallery show, doing the preview with the gallery director. He wanted to be able to tell stories about the images over the month. I was only there for that weekend. And I came in front of this image, and I couldn't remember whether I'd captured the snow or whether I'd rendered it with Photoshop. And it got me to look at the image more closely. It got me to go and look at other photographs of snow more closely. And it got me to go and look at snow more closely. For not knowing, I became richer because I looked more carefully. And I think that photography can offer many opportunities for that if we'll only accept that invitation. So there's one thing to stay up in this visual experience, and a lot of times that remains intuitive and vague. It's very often useful to follow it and put this into words, even if the words are just getting things going, to have some sense of clarity of what happened or what we're trying to accomplish or what I might do next. First time I went to White Sands to photograph seriously, I spent an evening and a morning, shot 24 rolls of film. Yeah, this was back in the film days. Came away with 2 keepers. Thought, okay, 2 keepers, not bad. I mean, how many images do you really make that are really worth sharing, at least in a gallery context, right? About 1% is what most of my colleagues and I have kind of agreed. And that doesn't mean you get to take your camera and put it on motor drive and hope that one, kind of the spray and pray phenomena doesn't work as well as being a little more considered, looking at your first shot, figuring out how to improve it, looking at the successes, and then how to do other successes that might build on those successes and even get out of certain grooves or out of certain ruts and into a new groove, right? It's useful to be a little more considered. But I hadn't really figured out why I like this image. I hung it. It wasn't quite as surreal as some of the impossible symmetries or floating stones that I'm known for. It helped a lot. Well, it felt good when my father came in and patted me on the back one morning because I'd put it in my dining room, spent some time with it. I think it's really useful to spend time with your images. One of the great things about prints, right? It's one thing to have them in hard drives. It's one thing to have them up on social networks. But how often do we consider them casually, for sustained time, a little more officially, like over time? You think a lot about how you interact with your images. So Dad came in and said, "That's a good one, kid. You managed to avoid all the West Coast cliches." That feels good. That's great. But I still hadn't found what I was looking for. Until my father-in-law, an engineer, came in and squinted and said, "Is that water?" Got it. I'm not photographing grains of sand. I'm photographing waves. I had to take his water and turn it into my wave. Important to personalize the language. But once I did that, I went back to the same scene, photographed for the same amount of time, and came away with 12 keepers because I was focused along lines that were relevant to me. And I had found a theme that worked through almost all of my work, the idea of waves. These were just slower moving waves. Ironically, after that long, hot walk, I took shelter in the shade of the park sign and started reading the literature for the first time. These dunes move 3 feet a month. It was there in front of me all along. And sometimes I think artists we all get into modes where we sense things intuitively, where we put a lot of information together, both things that we've sensed mentally, physically, other things that we've read. We aggregate a lot of information, and it comes out in the things that we do. And it's one of the reasons I think it's so important not just to think it, but also to do it, because there's another kind of understanding that comes from actually making something. There are a lot of other stories up on my website. I want to shift gears here and talk about, in this case, how tools can change perception. There's an awful lot of dialogue out there about the latest megapixel count, or how many picoliters come off a printer, or what kind of fancy routines you can do with your software. It's fun. I mean, we live in an amazing time, more change to this medium of photography in the last 10 years than in its 175-year history. Remember years ago, this was about 15 years ago, an analogy in Mac world, if you took the Rolls-Royce and the personal computer, gave the same decrease in price and same increase in performance, the Rolls-Royce would go 7 times the speed of sound and cost 70 cents. Of course, that's 15 years out of date, so I have absolutely no idea what the new math is, right? Very interesting. Have our ideas about what photography is, how we can practice it, not how we should. Remember, there's no cheating in the arts or in anything really. It's really just a matter of misrepresentation. If I put one of my surreal composites in Time magazine, I'm misrepresenting that it is that kind of photograph and belongs in that kind of context. There's nothing cheating about it. I think we need to just do the work we need to do and then start to make some interesting statements about what happened and decide, well, what kind of photography is it and what uses can I put it to? But none of this limiting, thou shalt not. Who wrote those commandments? Who gave them the right? We need to all give ourselves the right to rewrite that playbook and play our own games, the games that will help us get where we want to go in our own authentic ways. Right? So it's great to have the training, not only of a painter, but also of a photographer. My dad's a well-known fine art photographer, and he taught me what I know about black and white photography. My mother also taught me about offset printing, and it was a great combination because inkjet, digital cameras, it all came together. Plus the compositing, some of the painting. She used to be a painter as well. So it was a good marriage of all of that knowledge base, but I still have to overcome my curse of expertise. I've been trained to do certain kinds of things in certain routines. I've been trained to think in certain ways. And one of the biggest challenges for me is to rethink what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, based on new possibilities. And with this blistering pace of change, we need to do this now more than ever. There's some pretty wonderful, wonderful opportunities. So one of the big issues is in photography is learning how to think within the frame, how to compose those 4 essential lines. The 4 most important lines are the border, what's in, what's out, what visual dynamics you create, what's the aspect ratio or proportion of that frame. But now with stitching, we also need to learn how to think outside the frame. And it might not be creating a panoramic format like this. Sometimes it's just a matter of that extra inch, a little to the left, a little to the right, a little up, a little down. And I constantly have to catch myself and develop a new habit. If I find that I'm eliminating something and I say, that's the old sacrifice I used to have to make, and I just pull up or pull over to get the information, right? At the end of the day, all we really need to do is quote Pee Wee Herman and say, I meant to do that, right? That's what my artistic intention was, you know, like all those art critics some of us went through. What is your intention, young man? I don't know, you tell me. It's also useful to remember these panoramic formats are both vertical and horizontal. Or if you're David Hockney, they're all over the place. Pretty interesting way of representing what to us is a very dynamic, fluid, first alarm. I knew this was going to be fast. A very dynamic, fluid process of looking, right? How do we represent that in a still frame? So I'm not going to go through the Photoshop routine of just merging those two. It's fairly simple. Just to remind myself that there are multiple ways to merge it, and the way that I go through it will change different relationships within the image. Now I have the question, do I crop or do I clone? All right? Well, it depends on what kind of photography I'm trying to make, and also I think it depends on whether it's relevant. If I clone in something like the top of this sky, it's just white texture. Is that really cheating? Is that really misrepresentation? Should that no longer qualify as documentary? I'm not sure it's really relevant. On the other hand, if I take a panoramic stitch like this, and I know certain distortions are involved in that, and we'll come back to that in just a second, I can then decide, do I crop or do I clone? How much do I crop or clone? If I decide to crop this much, because I want to make sure that's there and I'm left over with this, am I willing to clone that out? If I do something like that, and it's amazing how fluid that is today. So if we do something like content-aware fill, And believe it or not, they've even got stuff on mobile platforms these days for this kind of technology that will sample other areas. Now, if somebody is looking at it from a geologic standpoint or from cartography, Houston, we have a problem, right? I'm going to get fired from the Sun-Times. Well, maybe not the Sun-Times, but the New York Times. Right? Okay. Like, in my case, though, if I'm making a fine art print, is it really relevant? Does it matter? Am I willing to aestheticize? Depends on the type of image that I'm making. And often I'll make multiple kinds of images presented in context with one another, and the clues that I do or don't do something indicates what kind of photograph it is. So what about taking an image like this and turning it into an image like that? Yes, of course, there are special effects added to that, but look at the spatial relationships in that. Now, lens profiles were designed to cure the side effects of lenses. An interesting proposition right there, right? So the optical system introduces distortions, which are okay in journalistic contexts, or it's useful to identify those in forensic areas. You need to know what was involved so you can interpret the data. And I think that's the most important thing, disclosure, right? So we can understand what's been done and how this thing has been created. But if I start to do something like arbitrarily change the spatial relationships, pulling the foreground forward, pushing the background back, making this feel longer, it increases the sense of recession within the image, it compacts relationships here. You can see this kind of thing in swings and tilts with view cameras, right? And this is being able to do it after the fact. And one of the challenges here is to be able to think predictively in the field. Should I change my angle of view? Or shall I change some of those spatial relationships in post? It's got me thinking about framing in a very different way than I used to. And it's calling me to develop a new habit to explore the relative proportions, the spatial relationships between objects in the frame so that I can make them more powerful, make them more expressive, fine-tune it, whether subtly or dramatically. Sometimes just using this just a little bit produces a lot of change. But it's a new habit that I think we all should be aware that it might benefit many of us to acquire, right? This is not the way that I was trained to think about photography. And I just have to remember, it's not the same photography that it was so many years ago. For instance, will the real photograph still please stand up? Okay, so it's a composite. I guess none of them are a real photograph. No, it's a different kind of photograph. Okay, so let me rephrase the question. See how important phrasing the question is? Which is the original aspect ratio, or the aspect ratio that I finally landed on? I think we'll all agree that we have a different visual response to a horizontal panorama than we do to something that's horizontal, square, vertical, or vertical panorama. And we can do that very convincingly. Let me show you. So I'm just going to duplicate the layer here and transform it. Child's play, right? Edit, transform. We're just going to distort the frame. Past a certain point, you can see things get obviously distorted. But if you hadn't seen the original, would you know that something like that had been distorted? Probably not. After all, you've been looking at a slightly distorted presentation this entire time. Right? But you see, there's more than one way to distort it. If I came back in here and used content-aware scale, similar to the content-aware fill, it's looking at the smoother areas in the image and compressing them more. Look at the glacier. Do you see the relationship between the mountain and the edge of the glacier? And as that white dead space in the middle gets compacted, see how much more forceful the image becomes? Now let me distort them to the same amount, because I want an apples-to-apples comparison here, or oranges to oranges. So one has been distorting the sky and the smooth area of the snow more than the other. And you see the different proportional relationships? Certain areas have been distorted more than another. And of course, if I was willing to mask, I could localize that distortion as well, bringing them closer together. So this gets me thinking about framing in the field a little differently. If I see two objects that are far apart, either top, bottom, left, right, I know I can squeeze them in and intensify that relationship between two significant things in my frame, either by changing my angle of view, and if there's a wall or a cliff or a body of water I don't feel like getting into, after, in post, or both. See what this does to your brain? I said that's the most important thing, what it does to your brain. Because you start to see more possibilities out there, you start to think more predictably, and that's what pre-visualization is about. Being aware of what your tools are capable enough to be able to get the material you need to get the final result you're looking for. Doesn't mean there's not a process of discovery along the way. I'm not 100% certain that I want one form of distortion over the other, but I've got enough material in my original captures to allow me to explore both possibilities. I can get where I want to go, and that's what we would like to do. Be aware of the possibilities, photograph more versatily, make more of the situation, and be able to enhance it further to create results that we stand behind 100%. So I routinely play with things like how the frame is divided, selectively distorting the image, fine-tuning the proportion of it. They're very different visual statements. And I often like to play process of elimination. Too much space, too cramped, still too much space, still too cramped, one or the other. And this process of elimination helps a lot. And the other thing that's really important to activate all your full visual intelligence is to use interfaces that allow you to do side-by-side comparisons. I could look at this thing one at a time and flip back and forth between the other, but I can't make those fast decisions when you look at both together. Contextual seeing is really important. It's one of the things that puzzles me most about iPads or tablets. We're back to the Greek scroll. What happened to 2 pages? The image and text. Or the new book, web page and text. Or video and, you see where I'm going. I know there's probably a technological limitation of putting 2 touch screens, how much more it's going to cost. But to get away from that side-by-side contextuality is a huge change in the interface. And I think we need to think a lot about the design of interfaces. There was one TED Talk that I thought was brilliant, saying that in the 1900s, the dominant model was the novel. In the 20th century, it was the movie or film. And in the 21st century, it's now the interface. That's an interesting statement. So I start to have to think more predictably about things like, the basic building blocks of photography, time and light. I missed my top-selling shot because I was still thinking in 125ths of a second the first time I went to try and photograph Zabriskie Point in Death Valley. When somebody shook their finger, a friend of mine shook her finger at me and said, but I'll bet you could do it differently. I think she was thinking I was going to create some impossible symmetry, composite something unusual into it. That's when the light bulb went off and I realized I had to go back. It took me a year to get back, and as I was standing there photographing the same composition over the space of 45 minutes, I was thinking, oh no, I'm looking for dramatic light in every area of the image. There's going to be no shadow, no contrast. I had to modify my plan when I finally got to putting it together. But I had harvested, I just held to my original plan enough to get enough information in enough shots to be able to recompose that lighting situation, which doesn't exist at any 125th of a second. It's sunrise, 45 minutes later, 20 minutes later after that. It's asking me to think more predictably about time and light, those basic building blocks of photography. And it opens up possibilities like this. The same shots can be used to render entirely different versions of the same subject. This kind of stuff being done routinely in product photography. A little tougher in landscape photography, but if you've got passing clouds, they're really your friends. Full open sunlight, edge of the cloud is beautiful diffuse light, cloud for shade. So really, I think one of the things I like most about all of this is the way that it changes my mindset. And I think mindset is everything, prepares you for so much. Like for a draftsman, for a compositor, to be able to think about putting pieces together makes me think about shooting fragments. I remember a friend of mine years ago railing, you digital photographers, you can't take a whole photograph anymore. Everything is pieces. So I had to figure out what I wanted to do with this and photograph a stone from half a dozen angles, all with the right lighting to be able to get it to fit together. I had to think about how light would create shadows, get distorted across the surface, how they'd be harder closer to the object, softer further away, and that they do contain color. They're not just black. What's interesting is, just like people who write really great fiction novels spend a lot of time observing reality and making a lot of notes, compositors, draftsmen, painters have to spend a lot of time looking at the richness of life in order to recreate it. And a lot of times this 125th of a second fast seeing doesn't get you to slow down and consider things a little more carefully. And when you bump into having to do something like this credibly, the more you start to get sensitive to that stuff, the more credible your fictions become. A lot of fun to think about just how you want to recompose an image. It's so much fun to cheat. I mean, play. And really, I do want to celebrate that playful spirit, because it's in that play that a lot of discoveries happen. It's also, a little bit of ingenuity. You go to the racetrack in Death Valley. It's too wet to get out to those rocks that slide around and leave those mysterious tracks. So you take the shots and you clone out the cracks to make your own tracks. Oh, you cheated. No, I invented. Right? And it's also very interesting to ask, how many ways can you remove something from a photograph and significantly change the statement and or bring something new to it? Interesting to think about bowls and paths. It's their emptiness that creates their utility. A room is useful because it has space that can be used. When does the elimination of something create something new? When is less more? So there's a whole new visual strategy here just by rethinking the game. And sometimes you're forced in these situations to come up with new ideas that you hadn't anticipated getting to. And you probably have so many ideas, you need to have a sketchbook to write all these things down, or a notepad, something on your iPhone or your cell phone, or anything to catch these ideas. The human mind can really only hold about 7 things. Unless you're Glenn Gould, then you can probably hold about 5 or 10 melodies at once, but he's unusual. Usually we can only hold about 7 things at any one given time, and we need some way to offload, that information and free our mind, our processing power up to do new tasks. So how we do that is just as important as what we choose to write down, because it will shift the way that we think. I remember coming back from Antarctica, sitting next to my friend Arthur Meyerson. He was watching me sketch on my iPad as I was working out compositions, and he was thinking, he leaned over me and said, "JP, your process is so different than the rest of ours." I said, "Well, it's not that different from painters. You just need to hang out with a few more painters, Arthur." But here was a friend who'd known me for 20 years, and he was still surprised by how I was working things out and developing things. And I felt, okay, it was time to bring that forward. So I put together an exhibit, a blur book to create a catalog for it. Now just recently released an ebook on my creative process, many of the things that go into it. And there are huge sections. There's a whole section on drawing, on composition, on color, and even cell phone photography as a way of playing and exploring ideas. One of the things that I want to emphasize is that very often we suffer from a curse of expectations that are too high. Let me ask you guys a question. How many of you can draw? Okay, so I got 10% of the crowd? Let me ask you another question. What happened? I don't know how many of you have read this book. David Bale and Ted Orland has this wonderful book called Art and Fear. And in it, they relate the story of a colleague driving his daughter home from school after class. She asks, "So, Dad, what'd you do today?" "Well, I taught my students how to draw." "When did they forget?" It's wonderful. Can you imagine a kid not drawing? It doesn't happen very often. In fact, when I go and ask kindergartners and grade school students, particularly the younger they are, we get an 80-90% response. And as they get older, sometime between the ages of 8 and 13, 14, they start getting more self-conscious. Fewer hands go up to the point where we get this adult syndrome of "I can't draw." Maybe I didn't phrase the question well enough. I didn't ask you how many of you can draw like Michelangelo. Maybe that's not your goal. It takes a lot of training. It takes a lot of time. I can draw like this, but I don't get the time to put 40 hours or 30 hours into a drawing, or even the 20 hours it takes to do something like this. I often don't find it's really that useful to put the 1 hour that it takes to do something like this, 1 hour to 20 minutes. More often than not, I'm just sketching on my iPad, sketching ideas down, knocking them out in less than a minute. It was a tiny little sketch that Edison handed his development team for the phonograph. It was this scrawly little doodle that he said, here, we're going to make this the phonograph. Think how much that changed. It wasn't a 40-page treatise, and it didn't exist yet, so how do you get ideas across that don't exist? Drawing is a form of ideation, and there are many ways to draw, and we don't have to look for what are you going to call it, sophisticated ways of drawing? I wouldn't even say that, because I think you can do line drawings that are very sophisticated, very simple things that have very sophisticated thought patterns behind them. We don't have to look for finished results if that's not what we're ultimately going to produce, but it can very definitely help enhance any of our creative efforts. I know that it does for me. When I go into a situation, I often take inventory of an environment. So I'm in Antarctica for the first time. It's a completely surreal, unusual environment, and I'm taking stock. I've got moon, I've got sun, I've got clouds. I don't have any stars because it's not dark enough. I've got mountains, I've got iceberg, I've got ocean. How many are the components? I might have an island. So I draw them out. Not the specific ones, but I draw a moon, a cloud, a mountain, an iceberg. Look, I'm just drawing icons that I can then reshuffle. What if I got them all aligned? What if they were nestled, that sense of being together? Or cradled, scattered. I'm still looking for this one, the reflection of a mountain. Antarctica being the windiest continent, it's hard to get smooth reflections. Maybe I'll have to composite this. But what I didn't realize when I was down there the first time, I ended up doing an editorial body of work, and it doesn't fit neatly into that body of work. I've had to reposition it into a separate body of work. And along the way, other ideas have come to light. The interesting thing is when you draw the combinations, you're more likely to see them. So these are some of the images that were produced along the way. They're not the specific compositions, but they're the same kinds of patterns. You know how you rent or you buy a red car, and suddenly everybody's drawing red cars. Sorry, driving red cars, right? You're sensitizing yourself to patterns. And you can use the power of self-suggestion to be more aware of certain kinds of patterns and tell your subconscious that certain patterns are more important. And there are a lot of ways of dealing with different operations, which can help not only when you're compositing, but also when you're out in the field. How many significant variations can I find on the theme of a tiny little mountain at the bottom of the frame and a big sky? Apparently there are a lot of variations, and I continue to look for more. Right? Now, this has become part of my repertoire. It's a pattern that I'm constantly looking for. We all develop a familiarity with certain kinds of patterns. It's kind of our groove, because we can see them very quickly and we can get more successful images that way. We start to understand them better. We learn how to make those stronger. We practice. Practice makes better. Forget about perfect. Right? And some patterns won't come as easily, but if you can identify the pattern and practice, it's easier. Strange thing. If you write something down, you're 72% more likely to take action on it. So if you sketch something out, I'm not sure what the percentage is, but you're far more likely to recognize that pattern, to learn new patterns. So it's all about pattern recognition. It's about recognizing the pattern, and it's also about creating patterns as well. I want to leave on a note I think is very important. It's very hard to be spontaneous in any arena that we have a high degree of expertise in. To play, to be spontaneous in that is challenging. It's one of the reasons I love self-photography. I challenge myself to take on a number of experiments and photograph things I normally wouldn't photograph, things that don't reinforce my brand. This is just for play. I have no idea what I'm going to use them for. I'm simply enjoying looking. But I'm challenging myself to try and look in different ways. This is a selection of images that all have this painterly look, and I'm wondering if it's the frustrated painter in me coming out, or is it a desire to look more broadly, to not get hung up on the details, to have a more spontaneous quality to it. I'm not sure. I'm still figuring that out as I continue. I do know that Sometimes they plant the seeds for other things. Most of the time it's just visual play. It keeps me sharp. I enjoy it. It's fun to communicate with people. Once in a while I'll find a seed that might be worth developing. A shot that I made a couple years ago at Point Lobos with my iPhone. And it set something in motion because I returned here this spring and shot with my DSLR in a very focused way and was able to be very productive in 3 short sessions and bring a certain kind of intensity and understanding because I'd done some of the visual research. I strongly recommend that you allow yourself to play, not only to rekindle that creative process, that spirit, because we get involved in creative lives because it reinvigorates us. It refreshes us in so many ways. It not only freshens our perspective, it puts energy into our system. It keeps our minds stimulated in interesting ways. Right? But along the way, we often discover some things that are personally relevant, that are resonant within us. Sometimes it surprises us what we discover. And I think it's important to give ourselves permission to make a little space in our lives, to be a little less results-oriented, to be a little more authentic, to go some places we never expected to go, because that's part of the process of discovery. I think photography is just one component in a process of discovery. It may be the area that I have a degree of expertise in. It might be what I do professionally. But I have to watch my curse of expertise and remind myself to rekindle that little kid who could draw, that little kid who could. Picasso said, "It takes a long time to grow young." I don't think so. We were kids once. We could all draw. We were all spontaneous. You ever met a kid who's not creative? You ever met a kid who doesn't ruthlessly, mercilessly push the envelope? Hey, Dad, you know that rule that you said yesterday? Does that still apply today? Let me test that. They reconfirm, right? They're natural-born scientists, you know? Theory, test, reconfirm, right? Endlessly inquisitive. And I think if we can rekindle that spirit and allow ourselves to move into modes that are less focused, we might discover more. Part of the issue is being able to get outside of our box. The thing is really neat is that we can adopt many different boxes, create boxes of our own creating, switch out the box. I mean, in order to think outside the box, you first have a box, right? But you don't have to play with one box your entire life. You can mix and match. And it can be very inspiring to do that. So I encourage you to engage in those ideas and allow yourself a little time to find out what your photography is. Certainly to be aware of what the new possibilities are because they're very expansive. We have this embarrassment of riches today. And rather than doing everything, I think we have to make some choices as to what's most relevant for us. But a little bit of exposure to what's possible out there will help you make better choices along the way. And it's certainly stimulating and a lot of fun. Thank you for coming today. And I'd be happy to answer questions after this. I wish you good photography or visual life.